Hi everyone, I'm Mandy and welcome to my channel. So last Christmas, I decided that in lieu of the traditional advent calendar, I wanted to fill one up with 24 days of Game Boy Advance games. A few years ago I shared a video where I did this with the Nintendo DS, and it ended up being one of my favourite projects I've ever worked on. The DS is my favourite handheld, and I actually got it as a Christmas present, so using it as the subject of an advent calendar was a very nostalgic and full-circle experience. This year I decided to recreate that project with the Game Boy Advance, which is actually a system I have the opposite experience with. I never had one as a kid, and even though I could play the games on my Lite, I had so many newer games to play that I never had much of an inkling to explore them. But it's a system I've recently started to become more and more interested in. So just like the DS one, the idea is that I'll be playing a different Game Boy Advance game for at least 30 minutes on every day of Advent. Now before we start, I want to give a huge disclaimer that I won't be giving full reviews of the games, but more so impressions, and very early impressions at that. I think more often than not, 30 minutes is not an adequate amount of time to get a full impression of what a game has to offer, especially for games like RPGs. So this is more about sharing and sampling some of the games I've been collecting over the past few months. There are some games I've put a few hours into prior to this video, so I'll be able to talk about those ones a little more, but I'll let you know as we go. The games I've selected to go in this calendar are a mix of titles from IPs that I'm nostalgic for, as well as some unique imports from Japan that were never released in the West. You'll be seeing a lot of adventure games, RPGs, and hit IPs from the early 2000s. So if that sounds interesting to you, I hope you'll keep watching. Without further ado, here is my 2024 Game Boy Advance Advent Calendar. So for the very first day of December, we had Bomberman Story. This one here is a Japanese import, but the game did get a Western release under the name Bomberman Tournament. I just happened to find this one really cheap. This is an interesting title because it's an action-adventure take on the classic Bomberman series. You still have your bombs, and they work the same way they do in the main games, but in this one you use them to aid in exploration. I definitely feel some Zelda influence, but it's still very true to the Bomberman style. I'm actually surprised at how well the two blend together. Bomberman is a series I've enjoyed in the past, but I tend to get tired of them quickly because it often feels like a lot of the same thing. But I think this style of gameplay spices things up in a really fun way. I've really enjoyed exploring this first part of the game, and I think I'll definitely be returning to it in the future. For day number 2, we had Chocobo Land, a game of dice. This one is actually a board game that stars one of Final Fantasy's beloved mascots, the Chocobo. It wasn't released outside of Japan, but luckily there is a fan translation patch available, which is what I'm playing here. The board game is pretty much a Final Fantasy take on Monopoly, but way more fun. Your Chocobo goes around the board occupying tiles by placing ally gems, which are basically characters that will sit and guard the spot for you. So for example, you could place a Black Mage or a Carbuncle on a tile to claim it, and then collect CP from your opponents whenever they land on it. When you reach a certain threshold of CP, you win the game, but as you go you'll need to spend it on things like ally gems, leveling up tiles, and of course paying opponents when you step on their squares. Every stage has a unique board, and unlike Monopoly, these boards aren't linear. You have to be strategic about what pathway you take because you want to pass over as many of the 4 special crystal tiles as possible, but don't want to land on enemy-occupied tiles, unless you have enough CP to take over them. You can also cast spells on your opponents to make them lose turns or mess with their dice rolls. Honestly, I think it's a really fun game. I'd already played it for a few hours before this session, and I was finding it extremely addictive. Once you get the board state in your favour, things can really snowball, so you always want to keep playing until you get yourself in a good position. If you like tabletop gaming, I highly recommend checking this one out. The game for day number 3 was The Polar Express. This is a platformer based on the 2004 animated film. As you can see, it's very Christmassy, complete with candy cane collectibles and Christmas tree checkpoints. I did find the controls a little awkward. Instead of running with A or B, you need to hold down the right shoulder, which has never annoyed me in modern games, but something about it here on the SP felt uncomfortable. Also, if you jump while running, you can't go as high, so it sort of disincentivizes you to be continuously running, but you walk so painfully slow that it's really hard not to. And the jumps in general are kind of clunky. I seemed to have a lot of trouble grabbing onto the platforms. The level design is pretty decent though. You need to find 3 bells in order to clear a level, and the stages aren't completely linear, which adds some challenge. It's not a perfect game by any means, but I did enjoy this little play session. And the music was lovely. I give it an A+ for atmosphere, if nothing else. Day number 4 was Fullmetal Alchemist Stray Rondo. This is another game that didn't leave Japan, but again, we do have a lovely fan translation. It's an RPG adaptation of the original 2003 anime, and I really enjoyed what I played of it. It has an active time battle system with a really interesting deck building element. Ed can use alchemy in battle, so every turn he draws a bunch of cards that act as ingredients. You can combine these to form different attacks, like cannons and giant metal punches. I have to say, as someone who adores Fullmetal Alchemist, this game has been an absolute delight. I really appreciate all the details in the battle animations. The atmosphere feels so true to the original series, and it is so nice. Also, on the title screen, it uses a 16-bit version of the first anime opening, which really made me smile. I think it's hard to say how much you'd like the game if you're not a fan of the anime, because the story is obviously watered down a lot. And it's also not based on Brotherhood, so you'd be missing a lot of the original manga story. But for me, this was a real treat, and I definitely plan to play through the whole thing sometime. And for day number 5, we had The Sims 2 Pets. So for those who maybe haven't played any of the console Sims games, they tend to differ quite a bit from their PC counterparts, and sometimes even from each other. On the PC, The Sims 2 Pets is an expansion, and on the GBA, it is a fully fledged spin-off. I remember I used to really like the PS2 version of Sims 2 Pets, so I was excited to try this one, even though it does feel a little different. In this game, your sim has just moved to Barkersville, a town where absolutely everybody has a pet. Seeing you as an odd one out, your neighbors encourage you to adopt a furry friend, and then you proceed to train them and go about your life together with them. Even though this game feels more structured than traditional Sims, there are lots of classic elements in here, like decorating your apartment and having to manage your needs. I still feel like I have a lot of things to discover about the game. I think 30 minutes wasn't really enough to get into the flow of things, but it seems promising so far. For day number 6, we had Densetsu No Stafi. This is the first game in the legendary Stafi series. We unfortunately didn't get this one in the West, though you may be familiar with the DS title, which was the 5th entry in the series. It's a platforming adventure game where you play as a starfish. It actually reminds me a bit of Kirby, probably because of the vibrant stages and the lighthearted feeling it has. The game's kind of silly, but in a way that I think is charming. In this session, I helped a hermit crab find his shell, and went inside a whale's belly to extract a spiky fish that was causing them discomfort. There's this cool thing at the end of the levels where you have a picture of Stafi on the beach, and it looks like when you hit certain score thresholds, a new friend appears in the picture. That made me smile. Next we have Choo Rocket. Now this is actually a port of a Dreamcast game that I really like. This one here is a Japanese copy, but it did come out worldwide as well. It's a puzzle game where you need to place arrows on the floor to direct a group of space mice to the safety of their rocket ships. As you play through the levels, the difficulty increases to include various obstacles that will affect the pathway they take, and cats that they will need to avoid. I think it's a really fun game for people who enjoy puzzles, and it seems like a decent port from what I've played. For day number 8, we had Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. This is an action-adventure game that follows the events of the second Harry Potter book. It opens with some familiar narrative exposition, and then we assume control of Harry in Diagon Alley. The first dungeon we get to play is in the Gringotts Bank, which felt a little random to me at first, until I remembered that the bank was a literal dungeon. In here, I needed to find 5 gems to gain a new spell that Harry would need to access his vault. For some reason, I had a lot of trouble finding the last one, despite the goblin here giving me a very generous clue. It seems like there's some degree of auto-locking for attacks, which I think is nice because it's hard to be precise with just a D-pad. I'm quite liking this game so far. I look forward to returning to it. On December 9, we had Magical Vacation. This is one of the games on the list I was most excited about playing. It's a JRPG that was never released outside of Japan, although we did get its DS sequel, Magical Star Sign. In this game, you play as a student at this very whimsical magic academy. It's been really entertaining to watch the dynamics among the classmates because they're all so unique. You have peers from all sorts of different backgrounds, and they have some of the most charming designs I've seen. There's something very quirky about this art style, and I think it makes the game feel really special. In this game, you can have 6 characters in your party, which is something you don't often see in these kinds of RPGs. Each student has a unique elemental affinity, of which there are 13 in total, so it seems like a pretty robust system. At the beginning of the game here, your teacher takes you on a school camping trip, and as I wrapped up my session, these weird alien-looking things appeared and spirited my classmates away to another realm. So I am very intrigued by where this is going. I think I will most likely make this the next GBA game I play through. I really can't get over how much personality it seems to have. I have a feeling it's going to be a really fun one. Day number 10 was Frogger's Adventures Temple of the Frog. As per the title, this is a Frogger adventure game that expands on the arcade classic in a way that feels very fresh. At least for someone like me, who's used to the Frogger crossing the road style of gameplay. In this game, you guide Frogger through a series of stages, collecting coins and avoiding enemies along the way. What I played of it was quite fun. The level design was good, and I felt that there was some challenge to it. You really need to pay attention to enemy patterns and hop with caution. It's pretty neat, especially for one of the cheaper titles on this list. On day 11, we had Cloa Heroes, which is an action-adventure spin-off of Namco's classic platforming games. Again, this is an import that didn't come out here, but again, a very nice fan translation is available, although for some reason I did have some trouble getting it to work on my flashcart. I think this is a neat little game, but nothing remarkable so far. It has a battle gimmick where enemies have an affinity to either blue or red, and you can only damage them by hitting them with the attack that matches that color. Aside from that, the combat hasn't been that interesting so far. I did just unlock the Wind Sword, which makes the basic attack a bit flashier, so maybe things will spice up a bit. I have heard some positive things about this game, so I wouldn't give up on it quite yet. But yeah, those are my first impressions of it. Day number 12 was The Hobbit. Now this one is kinda special to me. It's a game I randomly picked up at a local store a few months ago, and I ended up getting really invested in it. At the time of recording this, I had probably played through about half of the game. It's an adventure title that I guess you could call a Zelda-like, but maybe with fewer puzzles. I've found that it's a great game to play when I want to unwind. the gameplay falls into that really sweet spot of not being overly challenging, but still engaging. I really enjoyed traveling through all the areas and watching the story play out in this way. The Hobbit in general is a story that I find pretty comforting, and I think it lends itself well to this style of game. I definitely consider this one to be a bit of a hidden gem. For day number 13, we had dogs. So I used to play a lot of these pets games, and it was always a bit of a lucky dip because aside from the branding and the theme, the games were usually completely unrelated. For instance, I had Dogs 2 on the Nintendo DS, which felt less like a simulation game and more like a collection of dog-themed mini-games. And then there's Bunnies, which I don't even know how to explain. I heard that what would happen is that Ubisoft would take pet games from Japan and then rebrand them. So the GBA release of Dogs is actually a game called Kawaii Ko Inu Wonderful. I think this is a really cute game. You play as a young school kid who has just gotten their first puppy, and you spend most of your time in the game caring for them and training them. That's pretty much all there is to it as far as I can see. It's a kid's game, so I wasn't expecting too much. But yeah, it's a cute game for sure. Kawaii Ko Inu Wonderful indeed. And day number 14 was Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. So this one is one of the more expensive titles in the calendar. I've actually been playing it on and off for the past few months now, so I was about 15 hours into it as of recording this footage. But I did want to show you the opening as well because I think it feels very Christmassy. It even starts with the main character and his classmates having a snowball fight in the schoolyard. This is definitely one of my favourite, if not my favourite game I've been playing on the GBA so far. The story here is interesting because it's actually an isekai. It follows a boy named Marsh and his friends Ritz and Mute. Mute has discovered this mysterious book at a used bookstore, and they end up getting transported into it, and into the fantasy world of Ivalice. There are plenty of specialised jobs your units can learn, and in this game they are locked behind races. We have humans, Viera, Banga, Numo, and of course Muggles, who have a monopoly on the Gunner class, which I love. This is an interesting entry in the Tactics series because it introduces this lore mechanic. In each battle there are certain moves or weapons that are forbidden, and also ones that are encouraged, and you can get perks for taking advantage of that. Every battle is overseen by a judge, and if you break the laws, your units can be sent to prison. But later on you can get law and anti-law cards that you can use to manually manipulate which laws are in effect. So anyway, this Advent project was a nice excuse to get another skirmish in. I really do look forward to continuing the game. It's been fantastic so far, and I have a feeling the story is gonna have some good messages in it. The game for day 15 was Spirits and Spells. I did talk about this one in my Halloween vlog, so I won't prattle on too much about it here. But basically, it's a side-scrolling platformer where you switch back and forth between a brother and sister who have different abilities based on their Halloween costumes. I'm quite fond of this one, mainly for its atmosphere. It is challenging, but not in a super frustrating way, at least not most of the time. The levels just take a lot of learning and memorizing where all the traps are and whatnot. So yeah, this was a fun one to revisit, even out of season. Day 16 was Tomato Adventure. This is a Japanese exclusive RPG that I'd heard a lot of great things about. And luckily again, we have a fan translation. It was developed by Alpha Dream, who is the team that did the Mario and Luigi games, and you can definitely feel a similar vibe between them. It's set in a place called the Ketchup Kingdom, where kids who don't like tomatoes are shunned by society and forced to live in a village underground. I love the detail they put into this place. There's this one guy who has a poster of a tomato that simply says, "No." Very effective messaging. With some difficulty, the main character and his girlfriend are able to leave the village for a trip, because it's the day of the Tomatoversary and, I don't know, the rules in this kingdom are weird. The battles are turn-based, and you fight with devices called gimmicks. You can power up each attack by performing well on battle activities, like hitting A when a moving target is in the red zone, or rapidly tapping to fill up a bar. So far the enemies have been very easy, but I'm sure that will change further into the game. I really like the level design in this first area. It's called the Toy Ruin, and it's very colourful and quirky. I'll definitely be playing this game through sometime. It seems so far the hype has been warranted. On day 17, we had Aragon, which is a game based on the fantasy book-turned-film by Christopher Paolini. Now there are Aragon games released on the Xbox, PS2, and DS, but despite the fact that this GBA version shares the same artwork with them, it is a completely different game. While those ones were action-adventures, this one is a turn-based RPG, so naturally I was drawn to it. I think the battle system is quite interesting. Whenever you do a basic attack, you have to input a sequence of buttons, and certain combinations will unleash special moves. There are 2 rows, and it seems like melee weapons can't hit the back row until enemies in the first row are cleared, but you can get them with archers, magic, or by hitting them for collateral damage when using a special attack combo. I will say, the prologue dragged on a bit too long for my liking. I was really eager to get the story going, but I had to clear out so many enemies in that first area, and it became quite tedious. As I wrapped up, I was about 40 minutes in, and I had only just gotten to meet Aragon. It was a nice looking town I ended up in. I definitely want to return to this game sometime, because it seems like it has the potential to be something special. Day number 18 was Ms. PacMan Maze Madness. This is another one of those games that has taken a classic IP and experimented with it by mixing in new genre elements. For the most part, this game plays like a classic 3D Pac-Man, but it's also a puzzle game. In addition to collecting pellets and eating ghosts, Ms. PacMan must find her way through a series of mazes by unlocking doors, moving blocks, and springing between different areas. This was an unexpected delight for me because it reminded me a lot of Pac-Man Adventures in Time, which was one of my favourite PC games growing up. I think it's a pretty solid game so far. Another one of those cheaper titles that feels very much worth the money. On day number 19, we had Suikoden Card Stories. As you may have guessed, this is a Suikoden card game spin-off that was released in Japan. It actually has a physical card game form too, though I'm not sure which one came first. As you can see, here we are playing another fan translation. This was a very enjoyable game for me, and the card battles are actually pretty simple to pick up. Someone plays a mission card, and then you each take turns playing units, who have varying levels of attack power. The first person to reach a total attack power that matches the goal specified on the mission card will win that mission and receive its victory points. This repeats until someone has earned a certain number of victory points, upon which they win the match. It's a simple premise, but there's a lot more to the unit cards that make things interesting. The first unit you play needs to be a leader, and you can only follow them up with cards that share a link letter with them, or with other characters that are already in play. For example, if I play Rina as my leader, I wouldn't be able to follow her up with Shiro because he only links to characters with a G or H. But I could play Rina, Paul, and then Shiro by linking Paul to Rina through A, and then Shiro to Paul through G. If you have 2 units that share a Unite bonus, you can play them together and receive buffed attack values. And there are other little bonuses that different cards can have too. For example, Hannah's card will receive +1 attack if your discard pile is larger than your opponent's, and playing Rina will force your opponent to discard a male card. As someone who really enjoys card games, this was an exciting title to stumble upon, and I very much look forward to playing more of it. However, I did have some trouble getting the game to save on my flash cart, which could be a me problem, but I definitely wanted to mention it as a PSA, just in case. Game number 20 was Shrek 2 Beg for Mercy. There are quite a few Shrek games on the GBA, and this one is a little unique because it stars Puss in Boots. It seems like it tells the story of the second movie from his perspective. It starts with the classic storybook reading, but this time it's about him, which I thought was funny. He was pretty fun to control. I like how he does this confident little strut when he walks. After the first set of levels, you switch to controlling Shrek, and I found him way more frustrating to use. Obviously, he's much less nimble and very clunky. I did not enjoy those levels, I'll be honest. But thankfully, it did go back to Puss in Boots before too long. It's a fine game, but nothing overly remarkable. On day 21, we had Lord of the Rings: The Fellowship of the Ring. So this one is another turn-based RPG that I was really looking forward to trying out, but unfortunately it ended up being quite disappointing. It is rough. Firstly, the menu navigation is really janky and inconsistent. It acts like a mouse cursor sometimes, but it's not very smooth. If you want to move to different options, you need to double tap or tap and hold, and sometimes it works better than others. And this is all just to use basic commands like saying yes to a question or looking through your inventory. These are all critical functions, so it kinda sucks that it's so miserable to use. There also seems to be some sort of bug with the music where it will completely stop for minutes at a time. And sadly, throughout the entire time I played, I never once heard a battle theme. The battles themselves are extremely basic so far. You just pick a weapon and whack the enemy with it. I would hope it gets better later on, but I wouldn't hold my breath. I did some research after this, and apparently there are some game-breaking bugs later on, which unfortunately doesn't surprise me. I think this is an extremely unpolished game that feels like it was made for the PC and just doesn't work on the GBA at all. I've heard some great things about the other Lord of the Rings games on here, but I'd probably steer clear from this one. Day number 22 was Sabrina the Teenage Witch Potion Commotion. This was a nice palate cleanser from the previous day's game. I talked about this one in my Halloween vlog too. It's a puzzle platformer based on the live-action Sabrina TV series, and like I said in my other video, I consider it a bit of a gem, at least among my own collection and to my own tastes. The platforming is very smooth, and honestly leagues better than some of the other licensed platformers I've played on here. It's designed for a younger audience, so you do have some random memory match minigames and stuff like that, but I always find it a nice one to pass the time with. Game number 23 was Shining Soul 2. The Shining Soul games are action RPGs that served as a reboot of the Shining Force series. In this game, you can pick from 7 different classes for your main character to specialize in. I just went with the warrior for this session. At the start, you're greeted by an adventurer who claims his name is Boken, but you're not fooling anyone, Max. He gives you a brief rundown on how to handle monsters and then points you in the direction of the kingdom. The king's daughter has gone missing, and he asks you to investigate a nearby goblin fortress to see if you can find any leads. The combat is pretty straightforward, at least for the warrior. It's very hack and slash, and it seems like if you have good timing, you can spam attacks to avoid getting hit, so it hasn't been very difficult so far. The warrior can cycle between 3 different weapons, but I've been sticking with the sword for the most part. I'm sure there's still a lot more to the game than I've experienced, so I'm not sure how I feel about it yet. It seems okay though, and I'd be open to playing more in the future. But I do have to say, it has one of the most unsettling text sounds I've ever heard. So we have finally reached the last day. Now, even though I randomized the order of this list up to day 23, it is tradition to leave something really special for the last door. And so, for the final day of Advent, we have a bunch of Mega Man battle chips. Now these are for a GBA game, and what you do with them is quite spectacular. Let me explain. So on this channel, I've talked about how I recently got into the Mega Man Battle Network series, which is a really cool RPG that is on modern platforms now, but first came out on the GBA. In the Battle Network universe, Mega Man is a virtual net Navi that fights viruses in the net. He has a human operator named Lan that communicates with him via a small handheld device called the PET, or Personal Terminal. The games have this really awesome battle system where Lan will send battle chips to Mega Man by slotting them into his PET. The battle chips function as special moves or skills that can be either offensive or defensive. It's a really unique blend of deck building and action that takes place on a tactical grid. Now, in the early 2000s, these toy versions of the battle chips were released worldwide, thanks to the success of the game's anime adaptation. In the West, they were mostly used with the advanced PET toy, but in Japan, they also released a GBA peripheral called the Battle Chip Gate, which would allow you to use these real-life battle chips in the Battle Network 4 video game. And something that's really nice is that even though we didn't get the battle chip gates here, English copies of Battle Network 4 are still compatible with it. If you connect a battle chip gate to your system, it will reveal a secret mode that is otherwise hidden, called Operation Mode. Needless to say, I had the time of my life playing with these chips. This is supposed to simulate the experience that Lan has in the game, which I think is so fun. It really brings things to life. I have to give a special thank you to Tony for getting me these battle chips and the advanced PET for Christmas. I completely nerded out when I saw them in person for the first time. It was very thoughtful of him to get these for me, and I could not be happier with them. So those were the 24 Game Boy Advance games that I played during the lead up to Christmas. This was a really fun project to work on. Like I said in the beginning, I think sampling games in shorter sessions like this doesn't always do them justice, but I do feel like I'm walking away from the experience at least with a greater appreciation for some of these titles, and with a better idea of which ones I'd like to prioritize in my backlog. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get this video up during the Christmas season, but I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless. If you missed my Nintendo DS version of this video, I'll be sure to link it in the description below. Thanks so much for watching, and for all the support you've given my channel throughout 2024. I really do appreciate it more than I can say. Happy New Year and happy gaming! Bye!
As far as it goes?
Yeah.
Oh, that's so awesome!
I was like, what the heck is this? Advanced PET.